Welcome to my presentation, The Statistics of Margaret Thatcher. My name's Nigel Marriott and I'm an independent statistical consultant. Now, I'm doing this presentation because Margaret Thatcher aroused a lot of passion both among her supporters and opponents. And I've always felt with passion you can often end up with myths and legends. Well, Margaret Thatcher certainly has generated many myths. And I want to, in this presentation, to see if I can get behind those myths. And the best way of doing that is to use statistics. By using statistics to strip away the myth, I'm performing what could be described as a statistical striptease. And I was inspired with that description by Scott Johnson, the head coach of the Scottish rugby team, who gave this wonderful quote you can see here: "Statistics are like a bikini, they show a lot but they don't show everything." And I can't think of a better description of what a lot of work done by statisticians involved. Initially you have a problem that is obscure, it's covered up. Imagine it like a burqa, and you want to strip away the clothing and ideally strip the whole lot off. But if you can get it down to bikini, you have to call that a success. My statistical striptease consists of 12 charts broken down into 4 sections. First, I'm going to consider Margaret Thatcher as a person and look at the personal landmarks she set. Then we'll look at her as a politician, and a politician had to be defined in terms of electoral success. If they don't get elected, they can't do anything, or they are a bag of hot air. So we're going to look at election data. Then I'm going to look at Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister, and of course as Prime Minister her job was to lead government, set policies, and through those policies they would have an effect on the economy and society. And then lastly, I want to look at her legacy in terms of changing the nation. She is, of course, a politician with a whole ideology named after her, i.e. Thatcherism, and the chart I show here will show some of that legacy, in the way she changed the nation. There are many sources of data I could have used, but I've decided to restrict myself to these 4 here. Obviously Wikipedia is a good starting point because that contains links to many more sources of information. For the election data, I'm going to use the House and Commons Library. I think this is a very underrated source of data because they do some excellent analysis of elections, not only just UK but also for other countries such as the US. For the economic data, I'm going to use the Office of National Statistics. And whilst this site is unfriendly in terms of using it, if you know where to find the data, it is a very rich source of data, many of which going back a long period of time. And then lastly, I'm going to use Margaret Thatcher's autobiography. I personally think the only autobiographies of politicians that are worth reading are those who are at the sharp end, people like Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, and I personally enjoy both of their autobiographies. So to move on to Margaret Thatcher as a person and the landmarks she set, here's the first thing I want to ask you, is fill in the blank here. Margaret Thatcher was the first what to become Prime Minister, and the obvious answer is of course that she was the first woman to become Prime Minister. But actually that's not the answer I'm looking for, because to my mind there's a far more important landmark that she set, and yet it's been very, hardly touched upon in all the news after her death. And that is, she was actually the first scientist to become Prime Minister. The reason I'm emphasising this fact that she was a scientist is that scientists often have a very different way of thinking about problems and seeking solutions, and Margaret Thatcher had clearly stood out as a notable politician and Prime Minister, and I can't help but feel that one of the reasons she stands out is because of her scientific training. Now you can find out more information about her scientific career on her Wikipedia page, but I was struck when I read that by the fact that she studied under Dorothy Hodgkin. Now Dorothy Hodgkin is a notable woman in her own right. the Queen had an honour scheme known as the Order of Merit, which is very much an ultimate honour for lifetime achievement. And the first woman to be honoured under the Order of Merit was Florence Nightingale, but the second woman was Dorothy Hodgkin. And Margaret Thatcher is in fact the fifth woman to be honoured under the Order of Merit. So I do find it interesting that two notable women met there in the 1940s at Oxford University.
Margaret Thatcher was first elected to Parliament in 1959 as MP for Finchley, and then was re-elected 8 times until she stood down in 1992. But it's her performance as leader of the Conservative Party that, for me, that marked her out as the most successful politician in British history. As the title said here, as leader, she stood in 10 elections and basically won 9 out of those 10. So 4 of those elections were leadership elections, and she won all 4, including the one in 1990, where of course she actually stood down. But she didn't actually lose the leadership election to Michael Heatherstone. She just simply didn't win it by the margin prescribed by the Conservative Party. Then as leader of the Conservative Party, she led them into 3 general elections and won all 3 in succession, and became the first politician to do so. Tony Blair, of course, did the same thing for the Labour Party starting in 1997. But as we will see, there was a bit of a difference between Margaret Thatcher's 3 wins and Tony Blair's win. She also led the party into 3 EU elections, won the first 2, but then lost the 1989 election. And that's the only election that we can say that she actually lost as leader. I'm not counting local elections here, because technically speaking, they're not led by the party leader, they're led by the local party, and not every council is up for election every year. But it is worth noting that between 1976 and 1990 was pretty much the period when she was leader. The Conservatives actually had more councillors than any other party throughout that entire period, whereas before and after that, Labour was actually the largest party in local authorities. It's a fact I wasn't aware of until I actually dug this up, but it's another reason why I think Margaret Thatcher should be regarded as the most successful politician Britain has ever known. The thing that's most notable for me about Thatcher's 3 wins in general elections between 79 and 87 is the fact that the Conservative Party vote didn't really change at all in that period, whereas Tony Blair's 3 wins in succession were marked by a decline in the vote for Labour, and indeed they only won the election in 2005 because the electoral system at that point did favour the Labour Party. But Margaret Thatcher, as you can see, held the vote pretty constant, around 42-43%. The other thing I think is notable about a distance here between Blair and Thatcher is that their successors performed very differently. John Major succeeded Thatcher and again held the Conservative vote, whereas Gordon Brown, who succeeded Tony Blair, actually continued to decline in the Labour Party vote and of course lost the election in 2010. Let's move on now to Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, and I'm going to look at the economy here, because this is really the ultimate measure of Thatcher's policies and actions during the 1980s. And I'm concentrating on inflation and unemployment, which pretty much dominated the economic argument of that period. Margaret Thatcher made no bones about the fact that inflation was her priority. That had to come down. And when you look at the 1970s here, you can see why inflation was a terrible problem throughout the 1970s. So for her, getting that down was the #1 priority of her government. As you can see though, unemployment rose. She did succeed in reducing inflation, but unemployment rose. That was partly because of the recession that occurred in the beginning of the 1980s, and unemployment, as you can see, rose from about 6% of the workforce up to about 12% by 1983-1984. And this was the big debate debate of the 1980s. What should the government priority be? Should it be inflation, which when you think about it, high inflation really make nearly everybody poor. It affects the wealth of nearly everybody in the economy. Or do you focus on unemployment, which affects the few that are unemployed, but obviously has a bigger effect. If you are unemployed, your income is affected by a lot more than if you're suffering inflation. And this, of course, is the big debate. Now, I'm not going to go into the whys and wherefores of whether the government followed the right policies at that time. There is another slide coming up that I'm going to show you in a minute that relates to that, but there's plenty of literature around on it. The bit that I do remember very strongly from the 1980s was that in the mid-80s, you can see, unemployment remained pretty static at around 11-12% there. And it wasn't toward the end of the premiership that it actually started to fall. And this really was a problem for the government. What I didn't realise until I looked at the statistics here, that there is one reason, it's quite clear from this chart, as to why unemployment didn't fall quicker from the mid-1980s onward. And that's to do with the third line here, the green line, which is the economically inactive line. Now, this appears on the right-hand scale, and as you can see, when she became Prime Minister, 24% of the adult population between ages 16 and 64 were defined as economically inactive. That means mostly one of four things. You're either at home, a homemaker, and at that time that would have been predominantly women, or you're on long-term sick, or you're a student at university, or you've taken early retirement. Does not include unemployed, because if you're unemployed, you're deemed to be economically active, i.e. you're looking for a job, but at the moment you don't have a job. So the economically inactive, 23% of that adult, 24%, sorry, of that adult population, at the time she became Prime Minister, were economically inactive. And that rose a bit, up 25% by 1984. But then, as you can see, compared to what happened before or after Thatcher, there was quite a notable drop in the number of people who were economically inactive. So from about 25% down to 22%, about 3%. In other words, 3% of that adult population became economically active. In other words, they went out to work. And either they found work, in which case they were employed, or they were unable to find the work and they became unemployed. But just stop and think about that. If suddenly you've got this workforce, 12% are unemployed, and then all of a sudden another 3% join the workforce, then it's going to be difficult for unemployment to fall, because you've now got to find a job not only for those 12% who are unemployed, but the additional 3% who are economically inactive, and or suddenly become economically active. And had that not happened, had we not had that drop in economically inactive population, I suspect unemployment would have fallen a lot quicker. I do remember the debate of that time, and I do remember the contradiction of the fact that unemployment wasn't falling, and yet employment was rising. And it wasn't until I saw this chart that it became clear to me. As you can see, after Thatcher, the economically inactive rate rose to above 23%, where it's largely remained the same for right up to today. The Economist magazine came up with quite an interesting way of looking at the economy during Thatcher's time, and this was the idea of the misery index. As I said, the big debate in the 1980s was, should the focus have been on unemployment or should the focus have been on inflation? Obviously the focus was on both, but the real argument was which one became priority. And in effect, what the Economist has done is sort of split the difference to say, well, they're both equally important, so why not create a misery index where you add the inflation rate to the unemployment rate? And this is what this chart shows. And basically, this shows really, yes, you know, there was misery in the 1970s, particularly the second half of the 1970s, and that continued through to the early part of the 1980s. And then it started to fall towards the end of the premiership. But, you know, the fall wasn't that much, but it did start to fall. More importantly, perhaps, is that misery index continued to fall after she left Downing Street. And as you can see, right through to even today, the misery index has obviously gone up because unemployment is higher and inflation is also a little bit higher, but it's not at the same level as it was back in the 70s and early 80s. Out of all the charts in this presentation, I find this one to be the most interesting of all because it really shows the difference between the way Thatcher approached the public finances and the way her successors and predecessors dealt with it. First, just an explanation of what you're seeing here. The black line is the economic growth in Britain, so it's GDP, gross domestic product, and it shows percentage change year on year. So we can see that the economy went into recession, which is basically when growth declined, in 74-75, 80-81, the first few years of Thatcher's prime ministership, and then again in 91, just after she left office, and then of course most recently in 2008-2009. The red bars show the level of borrowing by the public sector. Now, I need to just explain these because there are different definitions of what borrowing is. This is borrowing, as I say, by the public sector, which is not just the government. It's also any organisation where the government either backs the debt or owns the organisation. So it's the public sector, government plus other public organisations. You can see that this is red to indicate that we've generally had a deficit. We've been borrowing money, though there's a few years where it's green, where in fact we were borrowing money. In fact, we could actually repay debt. You can see in recent years we've got the checkered red blocks. Now that indicates the fact that due to the financial crisis in 2008 and the government having to rescue the bank, the way borrowing public sector borrowing is calculated these days is different to the way it used to be done in the past. This is the result of things like quantitative easing by the Bank of England and the government taking stakes in the banks, etc. As a result of that, we need to add the checkered red block to make the most recent figures comparable with what you see in the history. The actual amount of borrowing that we have these days excludes those red blocks. So just the solid red block is what borrowing actually is today. But in order to make the figures comparable with the history, we have to add in the checkered red block. So that's just the explanation of the data. So why do I find this so fascinating? Well, look at what happened when Thatcher became Prime Minister. The deficit there, the borrowing deficit, was 5% of GDP. And during the first few years of her premiership, we had a recession. But there was no increase in this borrowing deficit. Indeed, Thatcher was adamant that borrowing should not increase. The government needed to balance its books. Contrast that with the other recession. John Major in 91 inherited a balanced budget, and he decided to deal with the recession by going in for what's known as a fiscal stimulus, which basically government increases spending by borrowing money with the hope that this will boost the economy. And as you can see, borrowing went up to 8% of GDP in 93 before coming back into a balance more or less at the time when Labour took power in 1997. At that point, Gordon Brown took over as Chancellor, and as you can see, he actually kept a balanced budget for the first few years of the Labour government. Indeed, you can see the spike in the public finances there, where he was able to repay some debt in year 2000, and that's the result of the auction for the mobile phone 3G licenses, and that netted a lot of money, something like £30 billion. But after a few years, Labour decided to increase public spending, and Gordon Brown financed that by running a budget deficit. And so we had a budget deficit of 3% whilst the economy was growing, whilst we had some good times. So that's the contrast with John Major. He inherited a balanced budget when the recession came along. Gordon Brown, when he became Prime Minister, almost immediately experienced a recession, but he inherited a budget deficit. Now this is the contrast with Thatcher. Brown in 2008 had a budget deficit somewhat similar to the budget deficit that Thatcher had when she became Prime Minister, but they reacted in completely different ways. Brown went in for fiscal stimulus that took the budget deficit to 11% under the definitions that apply over the whole history, the historical definition, whereas Thatcher said, no way, the budget must be balanced. And I think this chart just shows that contrast between the way she thought about public sector finances and the way her other Prime Ministers, both before and after, thought about it. One of the things that Margaret Thatcher is most well known for is the policy she introduced on trade unions, and in particular to reduce the number of strikes that occurred in Britain. As you can see, Britain in the 1970s was notorious for strike action. The number of working days lost to strike was enormous, and it culminated in 1979, which was the year that Thatcher was elected, with a winter of discontent, which actually preceded her election and was one of the main reasons why she won that election. And the 1980s, you can then see the number of strikes did fall, with one exception, of course, in 1984 and 85, which was, of course, the time of the miners' strike. And, of course, the number of days lost then was enormous. But she won that strike, and subsequently, in her later years, and, of course, in all the years that have followed her time as Prime Minister, the number of strikes now in Britain have really fallen to an incredibly low level. So this is a major change that occurred, and it can definitely be attributed to the legislation that she brought in the 1980s. You may recall earlier I said I put in that wonderful quote by Scott Johnson that statistics like bikini reveals a lot, but it doesn't reveal everything. I'm hoping you agree that in the earlier slides they have been quite revealing. So we've had bikinis, or may even in some cases had a G-string. And the earlier sections I felt it was quite easy to do that. But this section about how much of the changes that occurred in Britain in the 1980s and since can be attributed to her as a leader of a political philosophy known as Thatcherism. I think it's fair to say that we're going to end up with more one-piece swimming suits, and in some cases we're going to have more clothes on that. And that's because we're going to be doing a lot of correlation. We're going to say, well, during her time Prime Minister, this happened. It doesn't necessarily mean that because of her policies. Some of these may have been trends that would have happened in any case. So I'll go through these slides and try and point that out, and it'll be for you to decide whether or not that's due to her action or whether or not we're seeing a general trend that she just happened to be around in. One of the most common accusations levelled at Thatcher's time is that she was a divisive figure. Now, my thoughts on that is that, first of all, don't be under any illusion that the 1970s was a time of unity. As we've just seen with the chart of the strike, Britain was already a divided society in the 1970s. But I think what happened in the 1980s, the nature of the division changed, and a word I like to use is polarising. She was probably a much more polarising character than we've had other times in British history. And probably the best statistic to illustrate that is the Conservative Party's election performance by region. This chart here, as you can see, England shown on the left-hand side, Wales and Scotland shown on the right-hand side. And I said earlier that at a UK level, Thatcher managed to hold the Conservative vote in all three elections that she was leader in. And that was very much the case with England. With Wales, it was generally been the case. It's a slight fall off in Wales, but as you can see, England and Wales, Conservative Party fortunes have tracked each other both before and after her period. The biggest difference, of course, was in Scotland, where the Conservative Party vote fell away quite considerably by 8 percentage points actually, and continued to fall away, and in fact just simply haven't recovered a core at all. And the big issue, of course, that most people attribute to that is the community charge, also known as the poll tax, that was introduced in Scotland a year earlier than England. It is worth noting about that, though, that I feel it's unfair that Margaret Thatcher is personally blamed for that. It should actually be the Conservative Party in Scotland that should be blamed for that. The law required the predecessor to the poll tax, the rating, to be changed every 5 years or so, I think, in Scotland, which didn't apply in England. So the law was already different for Scotland versus England when it came to the rating system. It was re-evaluated, I think, in 85, and it caused a political outcry. And the Conservative Party in Scotland basically said, well, that's no good, we've got to change it. And they campaigned for the introduction of the poll tax in Scotland, which Thatcher agreed to include in the 82nd election. So, you know, whilst she became a supporter of the poll tax, it's fair to say that the original motivation for that actually came from the Conservative Party, the various politicians in Scotland, rather than Thatcher personally. This chart shows the party's performance in EU elections since the first one in 1979, and there are two reasons why I want to show this chart. The first one is the rise in the UKIP vote, United Kingdom Independent Party, which first sort of appeared in 1994, but as you can see, in 2009 they were the second largest party, and given current opinion polls, if this election was held again, there's a good chance they could even become the largest party. And I think this is an interesting legacy as a result of Margaret Thatcher's battles with the EU, the European Union, particularly in the late 80s over the direction that the EU had taken, particularly towards the single currency. And it's almost a feeling here that initially people that are Eurosceptic were looking for the Conservative Party to carry that out, but in the early 1990s the Conservative Party fell into major civil war over what to do about Europe, and so some people have basically set up UKIP. And when it comes to anti-EU feeling, then they are very much the party that people will now vote for. But without the battles that Thatcher had in the late 80s, I doubt if UKIP would be here today. I'm sure there'll be some dissatisfaction still the EU, but Thatcher expressed that dissatisfaction much better than any other politician, and basically gave them a standard bearer that people could refer to. So that's UKIP I want to refer to. But the EU elections also show another thing that people aren't aware of, and for me this is one of Margaret Thatcher's, one of her most notable achievements, and that's the performance of the Green Party here in 1989. You can see they went from almost nothing to 15% of the vote, and then fell back, and then sort of gradually been building their vote. Now, why did the Greens do so well in 1989? The reason is very, very simple. In 1988, Margaret Thatcher made a speech to the Royal Society about the environment. She specifically highlighted the hole in the ozone layer, which had been discovered by British scientists, and an international agreement to ban CFCs that damage the ozone layer was concluded not long after that. She also raised the spectre of climate change, or global warming as it was known back then. And she was the very first mainstream politician around the world, probably, to raise environmental issues, and particularly global warming. And in doing so, she made the whole subject of the environment a respectable mainstream political topic. Until then, it was regarded as a crank topic, and consequently the Greens didn't go anywhere. But with that speech, it just changed almost overnight. And consequently, the Greens were in a great position in 1989 to say, well, look, vote for us, you know, we care about the environment. And that's exactly what happened, as you can see here. I find it interesting today, the Greens are, not being at all complimentary about Margaret Thatcher, and I do think that's ungrateful of them, because frankly, they would not be on the radar of the political party without her speech in 1988. I mentioned at the start of this whole section that the statistics I'm presenting here are correlations between Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister and changes in Britain, but it doesn't still mean she is the cause of what those changes were. Now, the first two slides I showed you on polarisation environment in the EU, I feel quite confident in saying that yes, she is the cause of what I was showing here. But this slide and the next slide I'm less confident about, and I think she was probably more a symbol of what happened. So you're going to have to make your own mind up. In this chart here, I want to talk about the makeup of MPs and how that changed when she was Prime Minister. Let's start with women, who are represented here on the right-hand axis. When she became Prime Minister, only 3% or so of MPs in the Houses of Parliament were women, and that has been a pretty constant figure throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s. By the time she left Parliament, that has risen to nearly 10%. So the proportion of MPs that were women has tripled, and of course that continued right up to today, where it's now 22%. So is that just a reflection of trends in society, increasing number of women going into work, or were they women inspired by Thatcher becoming the first Prime Minister that they themselves wanted to be MPs? It's an open question, but you know, I think these statistics here are quite revealing. The other one I find quite fascinating are the red and blue line, particularly the blue line. These are the percentages of Conservative and Labour MPs, respectively, that were privately educated. Labour is represented on the right-hand side, and they typically were around 15%. The Conservative Party were typically around 75% when she became Prime Minister. But after she became Prime Minister, that started to fall. And continued to fall right down today, where it's now about 50%. Again, whether this is cause and effect, it's hard to say, but one thing Thatcher was very adamant about was wealth for all. I find it a little bit strange when people say she was just there to support the rich. Actually, no. What she wanted to see was see more people become rich, particularly working classes who are aspirational, and those that segment of the population switched to the Conservative quite considerably in the 1980s, and ultimately one would have expected that to be reflected in the MPs as well. And so what you see here in the 80s and since the 80s, while it's maybe not directly attributable to what, Thatcher herself, I do think it's a reflection of her political philosophy and the way those people that switched to vote for her in the 1980s and subsequently then joined the Conservative Party and became MPs. I think, in my opinion, this does reflect that change. One of the things that Margaret Thatcher has always been heavily criticised for is the decline in manufacturing in Britain, in the particularly in the early 1980s. Now, I haven't tracked down statistics that measured the contribution of manufacturing to the whole economy in Britain. What I've done instead is looked at where we actually work. Where did people work? Now, there's no statistics available before 1979, which is a bit of a shame, because I have a feeling that we would have seen trends in the 1970s that preceded what we see here. But in 1979, if you look at the top left-hand side, you can see 27 million people were in employment, and of those 27 million, 36% were in manufacturing or agricultural-related jobs. And you can see within that sector there are 5 different sectors. Of that 36%, the most of that was made up jobs in manufacturing. 24% of people worked in manufacturing. But at the time towards the end of the premiership, that had fallen to 17% of workers in manufacturing, and nowadays that's down to 8%. So this is the question in my mind. Was the decline in manufacturing that occurred under a premiership simply a continuation of a trend that existed beforehand? And this is why it would be great to have some statistics. Or can it be attributed to her policies at the time? Now, this is a big debate in its own right, and I'm not going to cover it here, but there's no question that the number of people in employment in manufacturing fell. The actual percentage change over the decade is shown on the right-hand side, so you can see manufacturing job fell by 29% during her premiership, or the first 10 years of her premiership, but then also continued to fall in the next 2 decades. So that has been certainly turned out to be a long-term trend. Construction jobs, on the other hand, as you can see, have been pretty static at 7%. So if people were moving out, not working manufacturing anymore, where did they go to? Well, as you can see, they particularly went into what we call private services. So 42% in 79, that's risen to 49%. Retail provides the biggest chunk of that, but other sectors grew under Thatcher. Most notably, if we look at the trend on the right-hand side, I've used coloured arrows to indicate whether or not the number of jobs went up. So green arrows, big green arrows, small green arrows, red arrows to denote decline. And as we can see, big increases in accommodation, food, admin support, professional, scientific, finance and insurance. It's interesting with the finance and insurance, because that's the banking industry, that was a big increase during her time, but not in subsequent decades. And that, of course, reflects the big bang and the opening up of financial services in the mid-1980s. Other increases also in real estate activity. House ownership increased enormously in the 1980s, and that continued in subsequent decades. The other interesting statistic, though, in the changes where we work here is in what we call public sector, particularly in health and social care, which has increased by 30% in her premiership. Now, we need to be clear, when we talk about the health and social care, we're talking about the health and social care industry, so it doesn't necessarily mean they work for the government. They could have worked for a private sector, such as a care home, which is often owned by a private sector company or indeed a charity. But such services more often not are funded by the government. So I feel comfortable in describing all of these sectors as public sector, even though they're not necessarily employed by the government, they're more often not funded by the government. And it is interesting, the big increase in the number of people working in health, social care. Again, I remember a lot of controversy about the health service during the 1980s, but it didn't actually mean that the number of people working in the health sector went down. In fact, it went up. And we can see that it continued to go up, and particularly the increase in the number of people working in the public sector under the Labour government in the last 10 years. So now we've come to the end of the presentation. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you have any feedback on what I've presented here, or you'd like some additional chart, then please contact me using the details here. Thank you.